Okay, maybe while folks are getting settled in, I'll just go over a couple of logistics as we're getting started here. For those of you, well, firstly, I want to acknowledge that we gather here on Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation here in First Mennonite Church in downtown Winnipeg. For those of you who are new, there are a single-use washroom right around out the hall, right, and a right into the nursery, as well as gendered and single-use washrooms in the basement. A note, we had some folks that are watching online, and so we did have a request. We have questions afterwards. There was a request that if you're comfortable to remove your mask when you ask the question so that people can understand your question a little more clearly. So last week I made the claim that I will tell you literally everything I know about sex tonight. A dear saint of the church tweeted in advertisement, "Come on out, it'll be great," or mildly uncomfortable. So we'll get the straight dude talking about sex in our queer theology series. And totally, so far as I know, I'm a straight guy. I can sort of tell that by the fact that I grew up in a conservative small town in which, you had to kind of follow a particular script within that place. And, when I look back, there was perhaps a couple of kinks along the way, but they got straightened out pretty clearly by the forces around me. And so I more or less could line up with the norms, the expectations, the images, the aspirations of the town I grew up in. And so that's about as probably good a definition of being straight as I could come up with. But I would add to that I never felt like I arrived. At best, gender, sex, desire, and power were always disciplined, directed typically by fear, shame, insecurity, and control. And it was a system that, whether you were on the inside or outside, could too often and too quickly turn to forms of cruelty. And so again, that's a little bit of why we had this series. Because to offer inclusion means to take stock of the rules and the expectations in the house you are inviting people into. And so I was pretty anxious this afternoon about the talk tonight. I take this stuff pretty seriously, and I think it's pretty powerful. I remember my kid was probably 5 or 6 years old. We were around the dinner table with my parents, and out of nowhere he says, "Did you know the German word for 6 is Sachs?" And it sounds like sex, of course, and I froze. My child had put the word sex on the family table, and I was completely caught off guard. And there is just something so primed in some of these conversations, in some of these spaces. And I don't always know how to talk about it or explore it, so we're gonna take a stab at it. So really tonight is for me an attempt to offer the best I could do in trying to listen and learn from various expressions of queer theory. I lean towards sort of those with a psychoanalytic bent. I'll get into that. But to bring that into conversation with our biblical tradition, which I found actually quite interesting. And I should note, for those of you who might not have thought about this, I assume an understanding that the Bible is what I would call internally contested. There's a lot going on in there. It doesn't always agree with each other, and it's not always all good. And that's okay. It just means we need to make decisions. And that's an important thing. You can't simply assert it as authority from my view. It means we need to make decisions. So this is an account of where I'm at. I'm pretty sure it will end up looking a little something like this. I've worked at this for a long time, and I'm not sure how it all hangs together. So I hope there is something here that you can take from it that's helpful or that raises a question, and then we'll talk about it. I certainly don't claim to have the answers here. From my understanding, if sex and holiness are discussed together, it is usually in the context of how sex is disciplined for the sake of holiness. Holiness is typically viewed as another word for purity, And purity in our context is typically another word for some endless moral aspiration that usually ends up producing blame, guilt, shame, and seemingly arbitrary lines of inclusion and exclusion. And so tonight, as opposed to thinking about how sex should relate to holiness, I plan on outlining how sex and holiness are two ways of trying to address the same thing. So as much as that's how this often feels in my head, I want to start with a very simple image. I want to start with a large context in talking about this. Whether we call it religion, politics, economy, or culture, there are typically, at least in Western history, expressions that try to account for everything. And so in our context, contemporary capitalism increasingly attempts to monetize all aspects of life. Laws are meant to account for and assess every action considered to have consequence, with police being able to enforce it. Religion and politics consolidate and articulate what is considered legitimate or even sovereign authority. So the imagery here is really, there tends to be something spoken or unspoken that's at our foundation, something that is, as we'll talk about, often unquestionable. And from there grow this framework from which there is sort of pressure in which how we live and creates a frame of inclusion and exclusion. So that's a simple framework, and we'll kind of keep coming back to that. Now, of course, none of these things run perfectly, but they tend to try to claim a sort of unquestionable completeness. Now, what's important here is that within these systems, we grow up with ideal images of what it is to be valuable in terms of beauty, success, power, what is right and wrong, in terms of behavior and roles. And so filled inside, if we think of this as society, you'll have images of the right gender, the right relationships, the right form of beauty, all these things that I mentioned. And so those things, these right images, are meant to fill up that space. Perhaps we aspire to those images, and perhaps we have been harmed and excluded by them. But they shape the fundamental aspects of what it is to be human in a given social space. And I think this is why it can be so hard to talk about religion, politics, or money, because if we disagree on some of those core images, it might reveal the gaps and the contradictions that many of us consider foundational. It will feel like our foundation or our order is being shaken. So, what's interesting is that in as much as those sort of bottom ones form some of the most important and powerful expressions of life, their source is also strangely elusive. After all, where does the power of money reside? How does a nation mobilize citizens to go to war? Who has really sat before the throne of God? Do not all these expressions come to expression by virtue of a shared belief? So what's interesting is that what's most important and arguably most powerful as humans are actually also the most elusive, hiding their origins, rationalizing when things go wrong, smoothing over gaps, inconsistencies that these authorities are unable to provide. And so rather than paying attention to the gaps and the inconsistencies, we actually demand that things are filled in or smoothed over, much like the fabled family picture where everything is just great. Because I think for a lot of us, we can actually find it unbearable to consider that there might be an absence or an emptiness where we want meaning, security, or stability. We'll return to this. So I think sex and holiness are two ways of talking about this fundamental gap, or absence or contradiction that seems to just persist in life. That reality which seems essential to being human, this thing that both anchors and overwhelms us. So in looking at the two things, let's start with the biblical imagery of holiness. Arguably no better place than in what is literally called the most holy or holy of holies, the inner sanctuary of the tabernacle and the temple. In that space was to be the Ark of the Covenant. Now, for Gen Xers, you might remember this as the time you were traumatized from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the face of Nazis were melted off when the Ark of the Covenant was opened. The imagery here actually isn't bad in terms of the structure of the Ark. But what's interesting about how they portrayed it is they thought that there was this secret power that was hidden and contained in the box. And I think that's sort of an idea that we often carry with us, that there's actual space that we can have access to. But that is sort of not what the Bible actually teaches us. So I actually kind of like this slide. It's a little kind of old-timey or old-fashioned, certainly not historically accurate. But I like how the cherubim, the angels, are turned in and what they seem to be looking at or not looking at. And so in the book of Exodus, you have this hugely elaborate account of how to build the temple, of all the laws, of all the structure that goes on around there. And then in the middle of that, you read this. The cherubim shall face each other. The faces of the cherubim shall be turned towards the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the covenant that I'll give you. There I will meet you. And from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the covenant, I will deliver to you all my commands for the Israelites. So in the midst of all this elaborate instructions, materials, and designs, what is the there in the bold? In the center of everything, in the place of God, there's nothing. Holiness at the center of life and authority and value is nothing that we can represent. The place from which God promises to speak, the place from which there is a living expression, this place must be kept entirely empty. So we have, in some ways, parallel imagery here. It could be argued that the reason idols and idolatry are rejected by Israelites is because idols smooth over. They fill up the gaps in our anxieties and the things that we just can't handle, that feel unbearable. It is this emptiness that feels unbearable as humans. We remember, for those of us who do the story of coming out of slavery, the Hebrews' impatience when Moses goes up to meet God at Mount Sinai. It was unbearable to just wait for what God would do. This is what I think gives the old idea of idolatry contemporary relevance. We have never really been able to abide by this absence. As I mentioned, this is the work of most religious, political, or economic systems. They will try to smooth over, avoid, or hide the gaping holes or contradictions of life. To provide images of life, vigorous, vital images that are dead and end up taking life from us. Some of the idols, I think, today are images of meritocracy. Ideas of being self-made helps us feel good when we succeed and justifies the suffering of others. There are, of course, the age-old images of the warrior, soldier, commander, lawgiver. For women, it is often to be mother or lover. There's the rational person for whom everything can be accounted for. And so idols are not simply what we really like. They are what we use or are given to keep from the fundamental reality that value and meaning are acts of faith without securing substance. So holiness can be viewed as a way that both acknowledges this absence and helps us to face it without despair. It acknowledges that we have authority and structure around us, but it's meant to keep that from becoming fearful and cruel, as well as staying active and dynamic. It is at this site at which we can be undone and remade. So what does sex have to do with all of this? Freud, as well as later psychoanalysts and queer theorists, began reflecting on sex and sexuality precisely as that site, which is both essential, but where things kind of break down, seem lacking, but also are generative, formative of both individuals and of society. They began asking questions such as how marriage, heralded as the pinnacle of love and intimacy and stability, is so often a site of violence and hatred. They took seriously that patriarchy is in fact a sex-based order of society, and so clarity and enforcement of gender and sexuality is required. They began to notice how any given order could never fully smooth over these contradictions, or absences, or impossibilities that they kept escaping in slips of the tongue, in our dreams, in our unthought actions. And so in speaking about patriarchy, Freud would talk about the phallus. To be clear, this is a symbolic object of power and authority. He talked about the fundamental experiences of the fear of castration in men and penis envy in women. We might think of these as dated terms if we ever thought they were relevant, but we are acknowledging this tradition when we raise our eyebrows at Trump's extra long tie, Jeff Bezos' rocket, truck nuts. I just found out about those not long ago. Or, well, this. I mean, this is the image here. So you got two young, vital, straight couple in bed with guns. I mean, that's it. That's the image, right? That's the dream. So this is still our society. This is our society today. Now, typically, we don't encounter, well, some of us, I don't know what you guys encounter. But I'll say probably on a daily basis, you mostly encounter this in terms of simple ideals. It will sound so good. You know, these are just the ideals of family, you know, the ideal of being a good citizen, of being a good Christian, of being a good man, woman, father, mother, all of these things. That's how we'll encounter this gendered-based structure of society, which still uses phallic symbolism as a means of access to power. So for Freud, and this is important, there was only one phallus in the system, that of the founding father. We might say the real man, which of course all men fall short of, and most try to compensate for, as we saw. And so this system is still in place. Mari Ruti, a contemporary theorist, says that while when she was a grad student, she was first offended by Freud's formulation of penis envy for women, but she eventually came to see it actually as an early articulation of female dissatisfaction, of being denied access to this symbolic realm of authority and power. Which again leads us back to the question of inclusion. Are we wanting people simply to be included in a patriarchal system of authority in which, well, sure, I mean, I guess women can have symbolic, you know, a symbol of the phallus if that works, you know, is that symbolic order still in place? So that's one way psychoanalysis began to think about these things. Another way of thinking about the role of sex in society is to look at the work of Michel Foucault, who famously overturned the common sense notion that the 19th century Victorian era was somehow able to censor or repress sex. Contrary to this sexless stereotype, Foucault explores how Western culture during this time was in fact saturated with sex in its attempt to account for, to manage, to classify, to police all aspects of sexuality through norms of etiquette, customs, science, and law. Society circumscribed sex in nearly every aspect, which ironically makes sex ever present in the attempts to always manage, administer, or cover it. Conversely, it means that sex is always lurking, fearful, and dangerous. So you have, this is a modesty blind for the shoe salesman, getting the woman try on shoes. So, yeah, I mean, it's evocative in itself, and there's a lot going on there. So, you should have seen the comment section where I got the image there. Which brings me to my next point. It's worth comparing this to how we understand sex and culture today. Since the so-called sexual revolution in the 1960s, it is common sense to view the West as sex-crazed. What we once tried to manage and control is unleashed and has run rampant. And with our lives increasingly saturated with online media and the massive accessibility to pornography, it can feel that perhaps sex has in fact been unveiled and exposed. Susanna Pessoen, in her book Carnal Resonance, cites the 2004 list on a list of popular memes that constitute what has simply become known as the rules of the internet. And Rule 34 is, there is porn of it, no exceptions. So, even if this is maybe a little of an exaggeration, what would such a claim mean? What does it mean to have the idea that there is a mirror or parallel of all of life staged explicitly as sexual? Sorry, anybody? I could have gone a lot of directions with the next image. It's an interesting phenomena. It's sort of, typically it's obviously terrible. It's like, oh, there's the innocent thing we have, and somehow these things too are sexual. Or it's sort of like, I don't know if you guys ever did when you go to a Chinese restaurant and you get a fortune cookie. So you take it, you read it, and you add in bed. So I Googled a fortune cookie message. This is the first one that came up. Don't hold on to things that require a tight grip in bed. But the question is, does this reveal anything about sex to us? Do we actually learn anything more from this idea that it's now everywhere in every form? We don't have time, there's a lot going on there, but I bring it up because I think it's actually possible to look at these two images and see both in the Victorian era and in contemporary online culture that sex continues to be something that we feel seemingly compelled to relate to everything. Or to put it differently, there remains something about sex that never feels like it's fully fits or properly understood, and so we try to either scrub it completely or feel like we can pin it down or expose it finally. And I think the point is that neither pursuit accomplishes what they claim. Victorian propriety, or purity culture, as we might talk about it today, ends up being just as obsessed about sex as online porn. Neither are satisfying as answers to sex in themselves. Both expressions, I think, try to fill that gap, try to fill up what is that absence that will continue and return no matter what approach we take to it. So, to recap, the dominant models of culture, politics, religion, and economy, at least in the West, attempt to smooth over or fill up the nagging gaps and contradictions in life because they are either hard to bear or they threaten a given order. And so we're given images and ideas to fill up those holes. In life, we will hear things. God has a reason. There's someone out there for you. You can achieve anything if you set your mind to it. Family comes first. Be your best self. You've earned it. Stand up for freedom. But I think something troubles all these images and ideas. For some are excluded and punished who deviate from them because they remind us of the insufficiency of these images, while those who fit in remain anxious to fit or prepared to lash out. To be fair, like I said, I think the Bible wrestles with these questions and also tries to fill in the gaps at times. But the Bible also acknowledges that the center is to remain absent, a sort of impossibility. If you try to completely fill the final meaning and authority to life, you will have created an idol. So in the modern period, psychoanalysis recognized that patriarchy attempted to fill that gap by a type of father figure whose power was meant to bring and keep order based on gender division. We are ultimately, and I think still left with, masculine images of strength, success, security, and authority. Sexuality, gender, and desire were disciplined for the purpose of creating hierarchical power structures, whether it was the family, household, the business, or government. But like the failure of Victorian modesty, the gaps, contradictions, and impossibilities continue to surface in ways that related to something about what we mean when we talk about sex. To put it in theological language, psychoanalysis revealed this as idolatry, an attempt to account for all of life through what ends up being an unjust or inadequate division of power and unhealthy disciplining of desire. Under this model, you exist either as excluded and punished or insecure and overcompensating. So, in what follows, I just want to offer a few snapshots of some of the queer theory that I've been interested in. Of course, there is all kinds of stuff out there, not all of which agrees. Like any group, there's often differing opinions. So what I'm going to do is sort of, again, just kind of offer some sound bites, some quotes that will give us a bit of a vocabulary and a language to keep thinking about this. And I picked these because as I found them, I saw them as attempts to resist attempts to control sexuality and honor that impossibility that remains in what it means to be human. So I already mentioned Mari Ruti's contention that we are still filled with phallic imagery. But then Ruti then gestures towards queer expressions and artists as some of those willing to explore what is possible when we acknowledge the emptiness of the phallic structure or have perhaps been rejected or felt unfit by this symbolic order. And it's important to note this isn't naive romanticism of the arts or beauty. Ruti acknowledges how awful a life it can be to remain outside the realm of symbolic power. But still, she speaks of those, and I quote, "Those who have chosen to stare right into the abyss of existence, instead of aspiring to phallic power and its illusory veils of protection. They have chosen to confront the intrinsic insecurities of human life head-on, with the result that they have produced works of unfathomable beauty while often feeling unfathomably awful. These individuals have created the kinds of legacies of the mind that demand a courageous encounter with the nothingness at the core of human existence." In the book Sex or the Unbearable, Lauren Berlant and Lee Edelman attempt to analyze, and I quote, "relations that both overwhelm and anchor us." I was quite taken by that phrase. "That overwhelm and anchor us, an effective paradox that often shapes the experience of sex. We approach sex here as a site, therefore, at which relationality is invested with hopes, expectations, and anxieties that are often experienced as unbearable. Sex, though subject to pressures of legal sanctions, social judgment, unconscious drives, and contradictory desires, hold out the prospect of discovering new ways of being and being in the world." So again, if you have that simple imagery of the frame in mind, they talk about all those things that surround it, all those pressures, and yet there's a sense in which you can honor sort of that unbearableness. There remains a site of possibility. Sex is evoked as that which troubles attempts at complete mastery, whether political or personal. Incoherence and division haunts and surfaces any of our fantasy of sovereignty. Rather than sex being that which completes us, it is a site of excess and undoing, and as such, a site of possibility and destruction. In their book Intimacies, Leo Bersani and Adam Phillips seek to consider aspects of sexuality as representing a site of human undoing. But in order to avoid any temptation of viewing this simply as a naive site of possibility, they dig down on the question of why this site of mutual affection and pleasure is also too often the site of horrific violence. Since sex cannot be mastered either within us or within another, and so the frustration of this reality can have violent consequences. Here we must figure out how to accept that in our loved one, we will never find what we sought. As Jacques Lacan put it, love is giving someone what we never had. That is, we give them what we have been lacking, believing consciously or unconsciously that they can fill our void, which is a terrible position to put someone in. Since Freud, we find that sex is not the answer to everything, but often a problem. Not a problem to be solved, but something irreducible and always at work in desire and in the doing and undoing of being human. So as I was thinking about all this, it was finally a phrase from Alenka Zupančič in her simply titled book, What is Sex? Very difficult to understand. But there was a couple of lines early on that helped me bring a turn of this back to theology. So Zupančič writes, "Sex is above all a concept that formulates a persisting contradiction of reality. And second, this contradiction cannot be reduced, but is, as a contradiction, involved in the very structuring of things, in their being. In this precise sense, sex is an inherent twist, a stumbling block of reality." The reason that this stood out is I was reading it around the time of Advent, when the lectionary was readings from Luke. And so we have our reading there. I don't have it in my text. "This child is destined for the falling and the rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign of contradiction, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed." As soon as I started thinking about that, I thought of Paul's language. "We proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." Is something that simply undoes and yet is the source of something else. And I began to think of a line from Isaiah. "Woe is me, I am undone." It is interesting, we're going to spend some time, we're going to have a good little Bible study here tonight. I'll fit this in, on Isaiah 6, because I think it's actually a fascinating complement to the imagery that I have lined up on the one side here. And it should be worth noting, there's a quote in Isaiah 6 that is the most quoted passage in the gospel. It is literally what Jesus uses to say, "This is why I'm preaching, this is how I'm preaching," a parable that simply works at you and in you. So Isaiah 6 and holiness. So I want to demonstrate how this chapter forms a unit honoring the fundamental absence at the heart of being human, which is connected to our overwhelming desires, and how facing and tarrying with this reality undoes us and transforms us, and that the message of this event is itself a sign of contradiction, or an impossibility, but also our hope. So the scene is set at the beginning of chapter 6 in Isaiah of Isaiah entering into this vision in the Holy of Holies. We kind of had that imagery earlier of God. God is never described throughout, but very quickly the entire scene is filled up. And so you have seraphs. We had cherubim at the Ark of the Covenant. Here we have seraphs. In Hebrew, I like this because that actually means like fiery ones. So that's the imagery. Fiery ones were attendants above the Lord. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, 2 they covered their feet, 2 they flew. One called to the other and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Our senses are meant to be overwhelmed by this initial imagery. There is the persistent beat of the refrain of the seraphs, these fiery ones proclaiming holiness that fills the earth. The floor shakes, smoke colors the air. I remember teaching a class on this passage, and the best image I could come up with was to give an impression of a nightclub at a dance, so you can see what I did there, right? It's the initial. I got a lot of stickers. There was an app. So there's a strobe light and speakers, and the floor's shaking because it's cracked because it's shaking so much. The seraphs are under there. That's the image there. So that was the image, because you're just supposed to be overwhelmed. And I remember thinking of that years ago already. And then, of course, thinking about this series, you can't read too far in queer theory and not have some reference to the club and dance and that culture. And so I'm going to read from a book called Impossible Dance, Club Culture and Queer World Making. I immersed myself in a full and rich experience that engaged all my senses. I heard the sonic ebbs and flows of the music as lights flashed and bodies moved in, front of, behind, and around others with a mass of movement that made it difficult to isolate individuals. I felt the touch of my own body to the floor, to my own body, and to others. I write what it felt like to lose myself in the flow of music and dance. Both are scenes of complete saturation. The author loses themselves on the dance floor, and what does Isaiah say? "Woe is me, I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips, live among a people of unclean lips, but my eyes have seen the King. I could not achieve or create what needed to be in my life through my own people, where I was from, but here I have seen God." Isaiah's self-understanding is shattered. Any fantasy of control he has is undone. He is at once anchored and overwhelmed, to use the language we've been exploring. Isaiah is overwhelmed, undone, and remade, and he's given a message. This is the message he's supposed to return to the people with. Keep listening, but do not understand. Keep looking, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull. Stop their ears, shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes, listen with their ears, comprehend with their minds, and turn and be healed. What sort of a message is that? Listen, but don't understand. Make it so that they don't hear you. The message is shot through with contradiction. It's a message that undoes itself and undoes others. Again, this is literally what Jesus points to in describing why he works in parables. Parables don't give information, they work at you. And then what happens? So you have this image of everything being filled with the holiness of God, and the word goes out, and everything is emptied. Everything, as far as you can see, is emptied. Isaiah has been undone, and this message is meant to undo the world. And then, after all of this has been undone, we hear of the trees even burnt down to stumps. And then there's a charred stump, an image of a severed life with the final words, and that stump is the holy seed. With Isaiah and with the queer theorists we've explored, we are given expressions that harmful ideals and idols of our world, that our world is built on. The holiness of God cannot be filled by an image or an ideal. And that which is within us, which aches and longs and desires, cannot be fully mastered or fully understood. Rather, we are meant to hold open a space within us, between us, and among us. It must be honored as that which is beyond our capacity and understanding, and yet is intimately necessary. It will, at times, feel unbearable, but can be honored to make us, unmake us, and make us again. And so we are in a moment where many of the ideals, images, and social norms are being undone with gender, sexuality, and identity. But we, as we've seen, remain with many harmful images of these things. We need to ask if the church is willing to acknowledge and identify the idols that we have made of gender, sexuality, and family. We often get this idea that that's what we're doing now by talking about these things. I'll get phone calls in the week. We just don't need to talk about this now, as though we're making it an idol now, as opposed to doing the work of identifying the idols that we have lived with for so long that have caused harm. So it's an honest question for churches in what they'll engage. So we do not aspire to holiness, but it is meant to keep us ever vigilant of the idols that are killing us. And I think queerness is one form of attending to holiness, because it is that which is denied and rejected by the images and ideals of society. Queer explorations of sex and biblical imagery of holiness acknowledge that which is part of us, but more than us, and that there is a danger and often violence when we do not understand this. The Bible is full of images of the reality of what holiness does. It transforms Moses at Mount Sinai. We've witnessed Isaiah being undone and remade. Paul often uses language of the transformation of the Holy Spirit. And Jesus' own body and life goes through several shifts and transformations at baptism, transfiguration, and certainly at resurrection. These are some of our witnesses. Theologically, we can speak of these events as acts of faith, in which one is willing to divest of the order of the world and acknowledge the impossible absence from which everything seems to have come, including and perhaps especially our desires which are not always transparent to ourselves, desires which need but never end. I want to include reflecting a little bit on the work of Paul Preciado. Preciado grew up identified as a woman, but for a long time wrestled with the way in which that simply felt like a cage, with femininity often being reduced, again, in this framework of being beautiful or a victim. So he began to explore what it might mean to leave femininity. But experiments with being a man just looked like another cage, this time more shaped by political arrogance and violence. What then? He just looked for escape and continued experimenting. I don't have time to go into a lot of the details of his story, but what I appreciate about his account is that Preciado did not think there would simply be answers, that, say, becoming a man would solve his problems. He seemed to know that identity was not something to be fully contained or controlled. But to remain as he was not acceptable either. And so he explored and experimented both with chemicals in his body, with ideas in his head, and with relationships around him. He says two things worth noting in relation to our imagery. First, he talks about the rejection and hatred he faced. He was thrown out by his family, often criticized and abused by those around him. His life was a witness to them of the insufficiency of the images and ideals that were around them. But this was only, I'll read that yet, don't worry about trying to track with that. But this was only confirmation of his desire for something beyond that fixed frame, the images that he was given of man or woman. He says this of his experience, and that's what's up there. All the things that are terrible and terrifying about transsexuality and gender transitioning are not found in the process of transitioning itself, but in the way in which the boundaries between the sexes punish and threaten to kill anyone who dares cross them. I would go so far as to say that, contrary to what is routinely claimed, the mutation process that accompanies gender transitioning is one of the most beautiful and joyous things I have ever done in my life. My life outside the regime of sexual difference is more glorious than anything you could have promised me as a reward for subscribing to the norm. Can we say that Preciado encountered something we might want to call holy? His willingness to acknowledge an absence and insufficiency without answer at the center of gender order and the cage that surrounded it, those simple lines that accompany us. He seemed to do this not believing there would be an answer, but that in honoring this reality, he might be undone and remade. Sorry, let's go back here. Nope. It's intriguing. I talked about, referenced Moses' transformation. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, the Hebrew word to describe his appearance after encountering God's holiness was actually ambiguous. It could be translated that he was either beaming or horned. An intriguing ambiguity in how we might understand the type of transformations we're talking about. Glowing or monstrous? This likely depends on how invested we are in the ideals and images of this order. This is, in fact, the title of Preciado's book, Can the Monster Speak? We tend to call monsters those who embody or announce that which has been denied by the images and ideals of our society. A system of ideals cannot abide such deviance, but among those who reject or are rejected by those ideals, we find those with eyes to see how holiness can come into the world. So what do I know about sex? It names the fact that we are incomplete, with gaps and contradictions and realities beyond our understanding. Sex relates to how we are brought into the world, how our bodies desire to extend and connect beyond ourselves, and how we bring other things into the world. It is about how our bodies shift and change and create throughout our lives. Sex relates to something unsettled, always at work, at once demanding attention, yet feelings at times unbearable. Unlike Platonic ideals and rom-coms, there is no other person that will simply complete us. There is the ongoing possibility of creating, undoing, and making again. Sex can neither be controlled, nor is it something that can simply be exposed or revealed. In our efforts to completely control or expose sex as individuals or a society, we typically end up hurting ourselves or others. Sex and holiness relate to that reality of being human, of desiring, of entering into but not controlling the miracle of creation, change, birth, death, resurrection, and transformation. I suspect this is true of any stage of life and of whatever configurations of singleness or relationships. Both sex and holiness have their idols, and we recognize them by the harm, abuse, and death they leave in their wake. And it takes faith to approach the reality that there is no perfect image of the body, a form of intimacy or commitment. To simply include people into a church or society that is still saturated by a hierarchy of values based on masculine images of power and beauty, patriarchal ideas of family, capitalist promises of wealth and success, is to do harm to the people we include. So I think the question for the church is how we live and how we worship, how we honor the holiness of God without trying to smooth over or fill in the gaps and contradictions in life, but to hold them there in safety with each other. To open that space means naming the idols we place there, and this is a lifelong spiritual discipline. Sorry. So he's kicking out patriarchy, Liberal individualism's coming in the back door. So again, this idea that, well, each individual can do what they want, but we're not going to change society and we're not going to address some of the structural stuff. There's always something coming back in. And so I don't know what you'll take from this, but there's really a simple image, and I think if we attend to that, if we understand that the foundation is always an act of faith. There's no claim to secure that, and any time that's done, it will likely be an abusive claim. It has to be an act of faith. And from there grow structures and norms and things, and we can't really get away from that. But we can talk about how we hold that space open and how we keep it from being filled with ideals, images, and ideas that simply are harmful for us, that really serve other people rather than us in many of our daily lives. And so we gather among those who have refused or been rejected by the images of the world, and then be willing to resist our own temptation to insert our own images, because it will feel unbearable. We'll want something really secure and stable in there. But we have to hold that the security is the faithfulness in relationship that we can build. And in that way, we hold a place where we might be undone and remade in the ways we need to. In Christian terms, by smashing idols and clearing that space, we are allowing the image or idols of our old body to die, so that in faith there might be resurrection to a new body, a new life being born, whether individually or collectively. I think that's good news for those with ears to hear. Thanks. So seeing that there's no questions, are there any questions? There was a lovely person online, maybe I mentioned at the beginning, if you asked a question, please maybe take off your mask so that they can hear it a little more clearly.
Hi, I don't know if I have a specific question, and I have a bit of a preamble here. So throughout your talk, I was thinking a lot about, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Audre Lorde. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of uses of the erotic, and a passage in that piece that has always really stood out to me is, for as we begin to recognize our deepest feelings, we begin to give up, of necessity, being satisfied with suffering and self-negation, and with the numbness which so often seems like the only alternative in our society. Our acts against oppression become integral with self, motivated and empowered from within. And so it's definitely the giving up of necessity, being satisfied with suffering and self-negation. And I think about how in this piece, Audre Lorde differentiates the erotic from the pornographic. And just from my experience, I find that a lot of the time it feels like the church is just combining those two things and not having that separation. So I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit what the motivation might be there, if it's to control, if the motivation is control, because obviously when people are empowered in such a way, big changes can happen. So that wasn't a very specific question, but if you could speak to that a little bit, that would be great.
That's a super great question, and just a super, I appreciate the inclusion of Lorde in there. That's great if we can just keep adding these voices, because I think that speaks a little bit to the Preciado quote as well, like just to say that that balance of your suffering in it and to do something else is going to have a process of suffering, but it's kind of worth it, and we need to get out of that frame somehow. That's a really great way of putting it, the difference between the erotic and the pornographic and how the church, I think that's I'll mostly have to think about that question because it's really good. I found it very interesting, so I did speak to some people from church who are not, it's not that they're not, again, like affirming, but they're like, well, why do we have to do all this? Why do we have to talk about these things? And then this was an older person, and they, what was it? You have to understand, we're old and we haven't, we're kind of catching up on these things. And then it was interesting. I made a joke he's like, you probably won't remember. You were probably pretty young, and he said a date in the early 70s. And then I said, oh yeah, I wasn't even a glint in my father's eye. And I'm like, oh, here I did this little like sexual joke, this totally straight heterosexual thing, this kind of erotic imagery if you want or whatever. That plays, right? Like we can do that, but then it's it's kind of that policing of what's acceptable and what we allow in that. And so I think maybe we do make some differentiation, but only in a way that again locks down certain ideas and images of relationship and those dynamics for sure. Yeah, thanks. If anybody else has further comments on that, that's a super great question. You're the person the woman said to take her mask off. There's this woman that always gets up and asks questions.
Yeah, Joel made me sit on this side of the room so I wouldn't have to walk as far. I'm just going to be annoying. What is sex?
Didn't you were you not listening?
No, I really want to know what, like, I have a follow-up question probably, but
well, no, I mean, honestly,
what's the working definition that you're using when you come to this?
I don't have one. I talk around what I feel like it relates to. I mean, like I really, for me, the more I worked with this, I increasingly became kind of taken in by this idea that sex and holiness are trying to somewhat get at the same thing. They're not the same, but so it's this thing that we all, we came into being as individuals. That's a sexual reality. Nature, there's this generative thing. And so Zupanchik's book spends time saying, okay, there's a difference between biology and animals. And then she says for humans, it's just this problem. Like it's not just instinct, and so you can't reduce it to, a list of bodily mechanics that this is sex and this isn't. So it maneuvers around this reality. It's probably a terrible answer. I don't know.
No, it's great, and it's getting at some of this. I wasn't sure often when the way you were using it tonight, whether it could just as easily have been replaced with love or intimacy or desire or these broader categories that would name a whole host of other kinds of relationships as well, or whether it was something very specific to sexual desire and connection and actual sex acts, or if it was broader.
Yeah, and that's where I like psychoanalysis, because so you talk about some of those other words, where we say, well, those wouldn't be present in an abusive relationship, but sex is, and they'll talk about how there's this thing, so again, like I really like the Lacan quote that, well, again, he uses love, right? But love is giving someone you don't have. And so you're giving someone your lack, and it's just this terrible thing, and so, I mean, yeah, he would talk about that as love, but I would think of that more in terms of sex as this thing we just can't escape, but and is really powerful, but can take on all sorts of great and horrible impacts, I guess. I don't know.
No, that was.
All right. Yeah. I don't know. I don't got the answers. That's other thoughts, and just thoughts too. Like I really, if it's not a question, anything that was raised by it. Great. Well, thanks so much. So again, just to remind you, we are doing one more week. So Jude is doing their session next Sunday night at 7. So we're very happy to do that, and look forward to as many of you coming out as are able to. So have a good night.